Good evening, everyone. And this is Bluebell reading another one of the wonderful stories from Enid Blyton's Stories for Bedtime book. I'm reading by candlelight tonight because I'm having a blackout. So do enjoy. Without further ado, I'll get started. Tonight's story is Mr. Twiddle and his wife's hat. Mr. Twiddle and his wife's hat. One day, Mrs. Twiddle wanted to take her hat back to the hat shop because she didn't like the red roses on it. "I would much rather have violets in my new hat," she said to Mr. Twiddle. "Don't you think that violets would be nicer than roses, Twiddle?" "Well, dear, hollyhocks and sunflowers are very beautiful too," said Mr. Twiddle, looking out into his garden all proud, where his hollyhocks were flowering very tall and straight, and his giant sunflowers were growing as high as the house, though they were not as yet out. "Twiddle, do you think I shall put hocks and sunflowers into a hat?" cried Mrs. Twiddle. "Do for goodness sake think what you're saying." "I was thinking," said Twiddle. "And I think that sunflowers and hollyhocks are All right, said Mrs. Twiddle quickly, because she didn't want to hear it. Not at all. She didn't want to hear all about sunflowers and hollyhocks, because all she cared about was her new hat with red roses. "You don't think it would be nice to have bird wings on a hat instead, do you?" she asked Twiddle. "No, I don't," said Twiddle. He was very fond of birds, and he hated to see them have to be on people's hats. "Why don't you have rats' tails or something like that?" "Rats are horrid things, but I wouldn't mind seeing their tails on your hat at all." "Twiddle, don't be horrid," said Mrs. Twiddle. "You know how afraid I am of rats, and I should run miles if I had their tails upon my head." Twiddle thought it would be fun to see little Miss Twiddle scurrying off a mile, so he began to think how he could get some rat's tails for her. But Mrs. Twiddle didn't give him any time to think. "I shall go back to the shop now," she said. And so she did. "You come with me, Twiddle. There's a dear, and you shall help me choose new flowers too for my hat. You can carry the box for me too. That will be a great help." "Very well," said Twiddle. He watched Mrs. Twiddle put her hat carefully into the box full of white tissue paper. "You tie up the box for me, Twiddle. Come along now, help me." "Oh, where's the string?" "As usual, there's never any string." "All right, I'll go and get ready," says Mrs. Twiddle, "and you just find some string." "Oh, well, of course there's none. There never is," Twiddle thought again, as he went out into the shed outside, where he knew he had some because he was all organised. Now, when the kitchen was empty, Mrs. Twiddle's big black cat walked in. Now, as soon as he saw paper, he got really excited. When he saw that white tissue paper sticking out of that hat box, he ran straight over to it at once. He crouched back and he sprang at the box. He landed inside the box on top of the hat. "Meow," said the cat, pleased. It began to play with one of the red roses on the hat, and it burrowed right underneath the paper. It had a simply lovely time, and it was all comfy in there. Mr. Twiddle was quite a while trying to find the string, and the cat played with the roses until it was all tired, and then it settled down inside the hat. It tucks itself into the nose, all comfy, and it went to sleep. It loves sleeping on paper. Presently, Mrs. Twiddle bustled into the room, all ready to go out. She called to Twiddle. "Twiddle, Twiddle, what in the world are you doing? I'm ready to go." Twiddle came running in with a large piece of string. "I've been hunting for string," he said. "Really, this is a dreadful house for string, never a bit to be found." "Well, hurry up and tie up the hat box," said Mrs. Twiddle impatiently. "You always take such a long time doing everything." Mr. Twiddle put the lid on the box quickly, and he tied it up firmly, and he fetched his hat and the stick, and he picked up the box, and he set off after Mr. Twiddle, who was already walking down the garden path. He was thinking the box felt very heavy, surprisingly heavy, Mr. Twiddle thought, and he simply couldn't understand it, how brave women were to wear such heavy hats upon their heads. "Twiddle, what are you puffing like that for?" cried Mrs. Twiddle in surprise. It's not such a hot day as that, surely." "Your hat is so heavy," said Mr. Twiddle, who didn't know what he was carrying was actually a large cat as well as a hat. "Twiddle, how can you say that my little straw hat is heavy?" said Mrs. Twiddle. "What a fuss you do make. I'm ashamed of you." Mr. Twiddle went redder than he was already. He hated Mrs. Twiddle to be ashamed of him. He took the box in both arms and panted along, but it was a really frightfully heavy box. "Oh, I shall have to have a rest, dear," said Mr. Twiddle, and then he came to a seat by the bus stop. "This box is a really heavy, and I hate stopping here, Mrs. Twiddle. The bus seat is just outside the fish shop, and I don't like the smell." But Twiddle meant to have a rest, so he sat down, putting the box on his knee to leave room for the people on the other side of the seat. Mrs. Twiddle sat down too. She turned up her nose at the smell of fish in the fish shop. The cat woke up when it smelt the fish. It was very fond of fish, it thought. It would be fine to taste some. So it began to wiggle around in the box, and it found a way to get out. Mr. Twiddle was rather alarmed. "The box? Oh, look what is going on in there." It seemed to be coming alive. It moved on his knee, it shook, and it wriggled. Mr. Twiddle held it very tightly, for he really thought it was going to jump off his knee. "What's the matter now, Twiddle?" said Mrs. Twiddle, noticing that Mr. Twiddle looked very frightened. "Well, my dear, you're not going to like this at all, but your hat is not only heavy, but it seems to be walking around the box." "Walking around the box?" cried Mrs. Twiddle. "Really? Surely not." "Well, whatever will you say next? You know perfectly well that a hat can't walk around a box. It seems to be jumping up and down in the box now too," said Mr. Twiddle, beginning to tremble. The cat was doing its very best to try and break free. It was doing its very best to get out, and it did a few tiny meows. "Meow." "The hat is talking," said Mr. Twiddle. "I'm very glad it's not my hat. I would never wear a heavy, hairy, talking, walking, jumping hat like this for anything." The cat suddenly went quite mad and began to leap and jump and scatter and scurry and scratch around at the paper inside the box. Mr. Twiddle could not bear it any longer. He threw the box out into the air, out onto the road, and Mrs. Twiddle jumped up with a scream. "Oh, my new hat! Oh, my new hat!" cried. "Oh, no! What am I going to do?" She ran to get it. She picked up the box and she took it back to the seat. It did feel really heavy. It did. It was as if the hat was leaping about. How very, very extraordinary! Mrs. Twiddle undid the string with trembling fingers and she took off the lid, and out with a big leap came a cat with a howl, and it scratched Mrs. Twiddle on the hand, and it flew off down the road with its tail straight up in the air. "Was that a cat or my hat?" wept poor Mrs. Twiddle, pulling out a hanky around her hand. "It was your cat," said Mr. Twiddle, glaring after the running animal. "That cat is always getting into mischief. Now perhaps you will say you're sorry for me for making me carry your cat such a very long way. Well, perhaps you'll say sorry to me for putting my cat into a hat box and letting it sit on my new hat," sobbed Mrs. Twiddle, taking a very squashed hat out of the box. "It's chewed the roses." "I shan't say I'm sorry, but I'll buy you some new violets for the hat," said a very kind Mr. Twiddle, who was upset to see his wife so unhappy, for he loved her. "Come along." "Well, I shan't say I'm sorry then, but I'll buy you a kipper for tea. But I dare say that you will guess that big black cat will get nothing at all except for a good sniff at the kipper. So there you have it. That is the end of the story. See, sometimes when someone's trying to tell us something, we're listening, we're hearing them. But are we truly listening to what they're saying? It's nice to help people. Sometimes we think that when we're helping people that's simply enough, but we're still not listening to them. In the end, Mr. Twiddle's love came through for Mrs. Twiddles, and he's going to buy her her favourite flowers, violets. So at the end of the day, it's lovely to just compromise with those we love in our families and to get a happy medium. Anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed that story, and I'll be back tomorrow night with another bedtime story. So I'll just blow the candle out now. Good night, everyone.